This is the podcast overview for objectives on Chapter 6, Stereotypes, Prejudice, and Discrimination. So first, contrast the key difference between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Understand how those terms operate differently and independently, as well as how they relate to one another. What is prejudice? What are stereotypes? And what is discrimination? Understand the role of risk-averse in assessing inequality between differing groups. So here we're dealing with how people see different groups as being unequal, and what's the risk in doing that when we identify groups in that way. Have a basic overview of how stereotypes operate. So cognitively, what's going on in our brain when we stereotype an individual, what different elements are involved in that process, and how do schemas and negative emotions provide the basic foundations for stereotypes. So we're going back to material that we've covered in previous chapters, way back to chapter 2 and 3, where we talked about social cognition and social perception. A lot of what we build up in the schemas that we have and of how the world operates and how people in the world operate provides a basis for then how we stereotype, as do emotions. Humans are emotional beings, creatures, and a lot of times we allow our emotions to overtake us, and we use those to fuel stereotypical ideas and information about others. Consider why tokenism exists and its implications. So first you have to know what is tokenism when we're talking about prejudice, and where, in what realms, what applied settings would we see that happening. And if it does happen, what are the consequences? What are the implications? What would happen? Discuss the idea of shifting standards in relation to stereotyping members of different groups, including knowledge of how subjective and objective scales operate in our stereotypes. So we stereotype people all the time. Some of that information is subjective. It comes from within. Some of it is objective in terms of like outward things we see or hear, and how does this change over time, or groups, because if you think back to 9/11, the group most stereotyped and probably discriminated against were the Muslim group, just because of the events that were happening at the time. If you reverse all the way back to World War II, it was, Nazi Germany. It was stereotyping Jewish groups. So it really, the climate of what's going on in the world can often dictate where we shift our prejudice to. Today, it could be Mexicans who are crossing the border, and all sorts of number of different individuals, right? So definitely that plays a role in the who gets stereotyped. Compare and contrast how in-group differentiation and out-group homogeneity relate to the development of stereotypes. So these are two concepts that help us to understand how a stereotype forms. We're going to be talking about groups a lot more in depth at the end of the semester when we cover chapter 11. But for now, in-group differentiation is really wanting to show how we're so different from those within our in-group, right? If you consider yourself part of a group, let's say a field hockey team, okay? You're all part of a group, you're all similar in that identity, that in-group identity, you all play that sport, but you might want to differentiate yourself from other people by pointing out how you're different. Within our field hockey team, we have the more scholastic people who like to study, and then we have the more like partying type of people who like to go out and party, you're going to strive to find ways to distinguish yourself amongst other in-group members. Whereas out-group homogeneity is assuming that people who are in an out-group, so not your in-group, people in a group other than your own that you do not mingle with, that you do not have an identity with, you see those people as all being the same. Like, you really don't see a lot of distinct differences within out groups because you're not a part of them, and you may have limited knowledge as to who they are or what kinds of things they do as a group or as a people. So homogeneity, just think of homogeneous, all the same, okay? And so that's a stereotype we tend to have, all those people, right? And you can fill in the blank with what kinds of people you might be talking about there. But it's this ideology that really lends itself to the development of stereotypes and those stereotypes sticking. Understand how people can be victims of stereotyping and not recognize it. That's important. Explain how hostile and benevolent sexism functions. So here we're shifting to a different kind of ism, the sexism, right? And we have different shades of that. There's hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. They're both sexism, but one comes from a negative place and one comes from like a quote unquote good place, trying to be kind, if you will, but still sort of failing. Discuss how gender stereotypes and differential respect for the genders often provide the foundation for the cognitive basis of sexism. Understand why subtle forms of discrimination, particularly in the workplace, may still exist, and explain what's meant by glass ceiling and glass cliff for women. These are terms that typically refer to how women in positions of power have been held back. Be familiar with the objectification of females in the media, especially via video gaming. This is we live in a current culture of high objective content when it comes to females. Females being seen for their bodies, being seen as purely sex symbols, females being used for that in sex trafficking, in all other hosts of ways. But it comes a lot from the media, songs that we hear, movies we watch, TV shows we watch, and video games that we play. All kind of feed into this objectification of females. Explain the 3 basic theories for why prejudice persists. That would be threats to self-esteem, competition for resources, and social categorization. Those are the 3 main ones. You want to identify what each of those mean, how they're similar to each other and how they're different, and the role they play in prejudice. Understand how modern racism operates in contrast to old-fashioned racism. How are those two different? So that's the racism of today versus the racism of yesterday. It's definitely, racism has changed. Some would say it's gotten better in some ways, but stayed the same in others, or just looks different. So explain what that means, give some examples of that. And in that, also understand the roles of collective guilt and moral disengagement. Those play a role in the old-fashioned racism and modern racism. Describe how implicit racial attitudes have been measured as a function of the bona fide pipeline, or use of the implicit association task or test, the IAT. So there's a video about that. It's going to be helpful, but you should definitely read about it first. We have implicit racial attitudes, which means racial attitudes we're not even aware that we have. They just kind of come natural because of what we've learned and what we've grown up around and what we've experienced. We might not even realize we have them. And so these have often been measured in different ways. How do we know someone has implicit racial attitudes? If they're not aware that they have them, you can't ask them about it because they wouldn't report that they did. But there's ways that we can test it to see if they exist. So understand that. And then explain how realistic conflict theory also helps us to understand the origins of prejudice. So this goes back to sort of competition for resources is related to this realistic conflict theory. There was a study done called the Robbers Cave study, a very famous study in social psychology. Understand what that study was, how was it done, so the methodology of the study and the results, and why is it relevant to the study of prejudice? Why is this such a big deal? What did we gain from this study that informed us a lot about how prejudice begins, how it starts, how it comes about? Understand the nature and effects of social categorization, and in doing so, highlight the relevance of the ultimate attribution error in social identity theory. So these are ideas that we've talked about already. We've talked about the fundamental attribution error, so it's similar there. And we've talked about social identity, and we talked about the self. And so these play a role in how we socially categorize people, and how this kind of colors the world that we see and the world that we experience around us. Understand how individuals cope with prejudice. So how do people typically respond to prejudice? Do they all respond the same? What are some different ways that people have dealt with it? And why would that be useful in knowing that? And then discuss how the social learning view of prejudice affects how a person develops attitudes about other racial or ethnic groups. So there's this kind of umbrella viewpoint called social learning view. It puts a spin on prejudice in that it talks about the way that people develop their attitudes about other racial groups based on what they learn around them. And then lastly, explain how the contact hypothesis proposed in the book and talked about how that can be used to reduce prejudice and the role of status. So this is one sort of means that's been proposed as a way to help eliminate prejudice. So that's a little bit related to one of your discussion questions, so big hint there. And that wraps up the overview objectives for Chapter 6.